Have Bibles? In the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, one God, Amen. Tonight, together, we will be studying one of those chapters in the Old Testament. One of those chapters. It's actually, as you will find out at the end of the talk, it is a very interesting chapter, very interesting story. Let's read it first and then we'll talk about it. If we go together to the Old Testament, 1 Kings, Old Testament, 1 Kings chapter 10. In our Bibles, if you have the New King James Version, this version here is page 339. Page 339, 1 Kings chapter 9. We'll be reading from verse 1 till verse 13, the end of 13. Now, when the Queen of Sheba heard of the fame of Solomon concerning the name of the Lord, she came to test him with hard questions. She came to Jerusalem with a very great retinue, with camels that bore spices, very much gold and precious stones. And when she came to Solomon, she spoke with him about all that was in her heart. So Solomon answered all her questions. There was nothing so difficult for the king that he could not explain it to her. And when the Queen of Sheba had seen all the wisdom of Solomon, the house that he had built, the food on his table, the seating of his servants, the service of his waiters, and their apparel, his cupbearers, and his entryway by which he went up to the house of the Lord, there was no more spirit in her. Then she said to the king, "It was a true report which I heard in my own land about your words and your wisdom. However, I did not believe the words until I came and saw with my own eyes. And indeed, the half was not told me. Your wisdom and prosperity exceed the fame of which I heard. Happy are your men, and happy are these your servants, who stand continually before you and hear your wisdom. Blessed be the Lord your God, who delighted in you, setting you on the throne of Israel. Because the Lord has loved Israel forever, therefore he made you king, to do justice and righteousness." Then she gave the king 120 talents of gold, spices in great quantity, and precious stones. There never again came such abundance of spices as the Queen of Sheba gave to King Solomon. Also the ships of Hiram, which brought gold from Ophir, brought great quantities of almug wood and precious stones from Ophir. And the king made steps of the almug wood for the house of the Lord and for the king's house. Also harps and stringed instruments for singers. There never again came such almug wood, nor has the like been seen to this day. Now King Solomon gave the Queen of Sheba all she desired, whatever she asked, besides what Solomon had given her according to the royal generosity. So she turned and went to her own country, she and her servants. I know that some of you might be questioning in your minds now, why did I select this chapter? It looks like a head of a state went and met with a head of another state. What's the big deal? Maybe some of you would think that this is now the political season and the elections and the changes in Congress and those things, so this is why we selected this passage here. But that's not true. And to prove to you that this is not true, let's go all the way to the New Testament and figure out what exactly Christ said about this event. And once we read that, we will discover the significance and importance of this event. Let's go to, keep this page on in the First Kings, but let's go to Matthew chapter 12, verse 42. Matthew 12, 42. Christ was talking to the Pharisees and told them in verse 42, the queen of the south, which is the queen of Sheba, the queen of the south will rise up in the judgment with this generation and condemn it. This queen will condemn us. For she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and indeed a greater than Solomon is here. This lady, this queen, one day she will condemn us, she will judge us because of what she did. And we will understand today why is Christ saying that. And interestingly, at the end he's saying, and indeed a greater than Solomon is here. He was trying to tell them that that lady, she took a very long trip. If you know where Sheba is, most historians believe that this was where Yemen is right now. It's at the southern tip of the Arab Peninsula. And now King Solomon, he dwells in Jerusalem. And this distance, if you look at the map, it's thousands of miles. It wasn't like the country next door, but it was far away from Jerusalem. And she took this trip to talk to Solomon. And he's telling the Jews, and now you have the one who is better than Solomon. You have Christ himself. She took this trip to see Solomon and his wisdom, but now you have with you Christ himself, the one who gave Solomon everything that he had. And Christ now is with you, and you are not willing even to accept him. We'll see today exactly why Christ was speaking very highly of this lady and of this event that we just read. Before we go to the details of what she did, I just wanted, Christ here was speaking about the wisdom of Solomon. I just wanted to make sure that we understand what is the source of this wisdom that he had. We will figure this out if you go to 1 Kings chapter 3, and we'll very quickly read in 1 Kings chapter 3, verse 4, verse 4 or verse 5 till verse 14. At Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night, and God said, "Ask, what shall I give you?" God told him at the beginning of his kinghood, he told him, just ask me for whatever you want. And Solomon said, "You have shown great mercy to your servant David my father, because he walked before you in truth, in righteousness, and in uprightness of heart with you. You have continued this great kindness for him, and you have given him a son to sit on his throne," that's Solomon, "as it is this day. Now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king instead of my father David, but I am a little child. I do not know how to go out or come in." It's a big responsibility on my shoulder. "And your servant is in the midst of your people whom you have chosen, a great people, too numerous to be numbered or counted. Therefore, give to your servant an understanding heart to judge your people, that I may discern between good and evil. For who is able to judge this great people of yours?" The speech pleased the Lord, that Solomon had asked this thing, Then God said to him, because you have asked this thing, and have not asked long life for yourself, nor have asked riches for yourself, nor have asked the life of your enemies, but have asked for yourself understanding to discern justice. Behold, I have done according to your words. See, I have given you a wise and understanding heart, so that there has not been anyone like you before you, nor shall any like you arise after you. And I have also given you what you have not asked, both riches and honor, so that there shall not be anyone like you among the kings all your days. No one like you. And we see here that God, he did to him what he asked for, which was wisdom and discernment. And he told him, يعني زي كده in Arabic we say فوق البيعة, like I will give you more stuff. You want riches, you want honor, take them. But the most important thing that he gave was wisdom and discernment. Actually, I remember St. Anthony was sitting at one point with some of his disciples, and he asked them the question, what do you think is the most important virtue? Some of them said humility, some of them said love, and he corrected them both and told them the most important virtue is discernment. To have this wisdom that this world cannot match. In this world, we talk a lot about wisdom in a worldly sense, based on our past experience, based on statistics, based on our knowledge, science, technology. We have something that we call wisdom, but that's different from what God can provide and what God gave to Solomon. It was a heavenly wisdom, which we call discernment, that you are able to distinguish between what's good, what's bad. You are able to make decisions based on a relationship with God. You know, I learned something from my job, that in this life there are a lot of uncertainty. Some of you might know this. I'm a structural engineer, and we work in building designs and stuff like that, and we try to protect buildings against natural disasters and man-made disasters, earthquakes, hurricanes, bombs, blasts, whatever. And we think that we know, but the fact of the matter is we don't know anything. Each time there is a disaster, whether it's natural or it's man-made, we found ourselves surprised. We think that we know how to design buildings and bridges and so forth, but with every natural disaster, there is always uncertainty. There is always something that we never accounted for. This is why the wisdom of this world, it is limited. It has certain limits to it. But the discernment that God gives to his people is not matched by this world's knowledge. Let's go back to that lady, and now clearly she heard about Solomon and about what he did. And this story, actually, if we wanted to give a title for it, our father, the father of the church, when they looked at this story, they didn't see a political event. They didn't see like one king meeting one queen. But what they saw is an encounter between a human soul and the King of Kings. An encounter between the Queen of Sheba, representing each one of us, and between Christ, the King of Kings, in all his glory and all his wisdom. This is why I said at the beginning it might look as if this is a political event or a dry story, but actually this is a very, very deep story, because it talks about the personal relationship between us as human beings and God as the source of all wisdom and source of all glory. It's an encounter with Christ. This is what this story is all about, an encounter with Christ. And the great thing about it is it elevates the relationship between us and between God from the level of knowledge and information to the level of experience, as we will see today. She heard about Solomon and his glory and his wisdom and all the riches that he had and the temple that he built and the respect that he had among his servants. So she wanted to see all that. She wanted to experience that with her own eyes. What she figured out is it's not enough just to hear. It's not just enough to hear about Solomon, but I have to go and watch and experience this glory and see what's happening there. It is the same thing in our relationship with God. We hear a lot about God and what he did with Moses, what he did with David, what he did with St. Anthony, what he did with the saints and martyrs. That's all good, but it's worth nothing until we have this encounter with Christ, until we have the same experience that those people had with Christ. Until this point, it's worthless. There is no point in hearing and hearing and hearing without experiencing this encounter with Christ. This is why the story of today, the whole purpose of it is to turn our relationship with God from a relationship on the level of knowledge and information and hearing into a living life, into experience. If we think about this lady, this woman, the first question that comes to mind is why? Why did she do all that? And let me remind you with three things. First of all, that lady was very rich. She was a queen of one of the biggest civilizations of the time. If you read in the history of that area, Sheba was not like a small city. It was in West Virginia. It was like something big at that time. So she was very rich, and that was very clear from the gifts that she brought to Solomon. Tons of gold and very precious stones and things like that. So she was very rich. This is number one. Number two, clearly, she was a deep thinker. And we know that from verses 2 and 3. If you look in verse 1, she came to test him with hard questions. In verse 1, by the way, for those who are just coming, we are in 1 Kings chapter 10. 1 Kings chapter 10. If you look in verse 1, she came to test him with hard questions. And in verse 2, at the end of verse 2, and when she came to Solomon, she spoke with him about all that was in her heart. So she was a deep thinker, and that's something that was hard to come by at that time, for a lady to be a deep thinker. I'm not talking about today, I'm sorry. Number 3, she was a great leader. Clearly, she was a queen. So she's rich, she's a leader, she is a deep thinker. What is it that's lacking? What is it that triggered her to leave her country or her city and take all this trip to go and see Solomon? She has everything that everyone hopes for: money, position, career, great intellect and mentality. What is it that you're looking for? Clearly, something was missing. Something was missing. She was looking for something. And when we read the story, we can infer some things about what was lacking in her life. Clearly, there was a void in her life. She felt that something is not right. In verse 1, she came to test, which means that she had questions and she had doubts about too many things. And same verse at the end of verse 2, she spoke with him about all that was in her heart. There was something missing, some void inside. She didn't know how to fill it. She also had lots of questions, very clearly, lots of questions. And probably I can venture to imagine that the top question that she had in her mind is, why am I here? Why I'm here? Why on earth I'm here? This is the 40 days of purpose that we are doing right now. Why God created me? What's my purpose in life? And possibly she was looking for God himself. There was something inside that pushing her to search for God. If you notice in verse 1, now when the queen of Sheba heard of the fame of Solomon concerning the name of the Lord, and in other translation concerning the glory of the Lord. So clearly she was not after Solomon himself, but possibly she is after God who is behind Solomon himself. clearly she was not after Solomon, but she's after the one behind Solomon, who is God, who gave him everything. And possibly she knew about that, and she was searching for God. We know that actually from the history. A lot of saints, a lot of people who were away from God, there was this nagging feel inside their hearts. Where is God? Moses the Black, for example, or Moses the Strong. He had this feeling inside his heart. Where is God? Who is God? How can I reach him? How can I be in touch with him? And this is what possibly triggered her trip to go and meet with Solomon. Not Solomon, but the one behind Solomon. I remember one of the saints, I believe it was St. Augustine, said that we will live in misery, we will live in sadness until our souls find the comfort in you. She was clearly at this stage in her life. Too many questions, unanswered questions, too void inside, search for God. Who is God? How can I get to meet him? How can I know about him? How I can find this comfort in him? Sometimes we see people who are successful in any sort of the walks of life. Maybe family, very nice family, maybe Christian family, they are church goers, the kids are nice, the wife are beautiful, the husband is great, doing great job. And when you get to deal with those people, sometimes you feel that something is lacking. It's this encounter with Christ, this relationship with Christ. Believe me, no family, no career, no money, nothing will satisfy this need inside one's heart unless he gets this encounter with Christ. And we'll see how we can get through this encounter. But if we identified 3 things in her life that triggered her to do this trip, the void, the unanswered questions, and the search for God, we will find here that God answered all her requests. The void, let's look at verse 13, what it says. Now King Solomon, this is at the end, gave the queen of Sheba all she desired. Everything that she desired, everything that she was looking for, she received an answer. Whatever she asked, besides what Solomon had given her according to the royal generosity, even more than what she desired. She got more than what she desired. This void was filled through this encounter. She had lots of questions. Let's see what verse 3 says. So Solomon answered all her questions. All her questions. All her questions were answered. I remember I was listening once to a sermon by Abuna Matta al-Miskin, and he was talking about a lot of times he would get a young monk or some visitors who would come and tell him, Abuna, I have lots of questions. I'm confused about too many things. So Abuna would just comfort him and say, okay, we'll sit down and talk, but let's pray first. And then they stand up for prayer, and Abuna Matta would say at the end of the prayer, the person would say, questions? What questions? They are all gone. And Abuna would comment and say that the presence of Christ in our lives not only answers all questions, but wipes out all questions. All confusion and all the unanswered questions and all the fights inside, all these are gone with the presence of Christ. And this is exactly what she experienced in this encounter with Christ, that all her questions were answered. The third possible reason for her trip was she is searching for God. And let's see what verse 9 says. Blessed be the Lord your God who delighted in you. Clearly from this encounter with Solomon, the King of Kings and the source of all wisdom, she saw God. And she experienced God, and she had this encounter, and she found all the answers for the search and for the questions that were bothering her. Now let's see the steps she took in order to get the answer to all her questions and all the issues that she came with. First of all, as I mentioned, she used to live in Sheba, which is thousands of miles away from from Jerusalem, where Solomon used to be. She had to take this long trip. It wasn't an easy trip. It's, if you know the geography of this area, it's all desert. It wasn't an easy trip by any means. And the first step to really have a real encounter with Christ is always you have to put an effort. I know that we all hate to hear this, but this is the bottom line. You cannot avoid it. You have to put an effort. As Abuna Anthony always says, you have to get out of your comfort zone. You have to get out of your comfort zone. I know that a lot of us would say, that's hard. And a lot of us would say, I'm not going to do it because of that. A lot of people actually, once they hear that, they just turn away from God. It might be waking up early in the morning to spend some time with Christ. It might be abandoning a certain relationship for which Christ is not happy. It might be too many things. But there is no relationship with Christ, truly a true encounter with Christ, without doing this step. Get out of your comfort zone in order to experience the relationship with Christ. This is number one. Put an effort into this relationship. Number two, in order, while preparing for this trip, apparently she took a lot of gifts with her. We can see this in verses 2 through 5. Gold and very precious stones and precious woods and other things as well. You have to give something to God too. Some people give their heart, some people give their money, some people give their time, others give their lives. There are people who gave their life to God. I always remember when we talk about gifts to God, that lady, or the ladies actually, who came to Christ and poured this fragrant oil, this very precious spikenard or fragrant oil on the feet of Christ. People might consider this crazy. People might consider this nonsense. Even one of the disciples thought that this would have been better spent on the poor or any other cause. But for Christ, there is nothing that breaks his heart more than those things. Again, as Abuna Anthony used to say, do something crazy for Christ. Crazy for Christ. Let's see what St. Paul said about that in his epistle to Philippi in chapter 3. Philippians chapter 3 verse 8. Let's do it at 7. Philippians 3:7. But what things were gained to me, these I have counted loss for Christ. Yet indeed I also count all things loss for the excellence of the knowledge of Christ Jesus my Lord, for whom I have suffered the loss of all things, and count them as rubbish, that I may gain Christ. For whom I have suffered the loss of all things, and count them as rubbish, and count them as garbage. This is an example of someone who sacrificed everything for the sake of Christ. He gave his whole life, his whole heart, his whole time. He could have been a great teacher of the Jewish nation. He could have made a great family. He could have won a lot of money. He could have done too many things. But he put everything aside just for the sake of the knowledge of Jesus Christ. And he considered everything is garbage. Everything is nothing, is rubbish, compared with the moment in which he sits at the feet of the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. It's amazing. But I wanted to emphasize this, that there is no strong spiritual life and no strong relationship or encounter with Christ without offering something to him. Heart, money, life. Those people who sacrifice their lives for missionary work or for doing any kind of service, they are not crazy. here actually are the wisest. So number one, she took an effort, a big effort, to meet with him. Number two, she gave him a lot of gifts. And the third step in her road was in verse 3. No, I'm sorry, at the end of verse 2. And when she came to Solomon, she spoke with him about all that was in her heart. She spoke with him about all that was in her heart, everything that was in her heart. Desires, ambitions, fears, emotions, weaknesses, confusions, everything. She opened up completely to him. This is exactly what our prayer should look like. It's not like I have 1, 2, 3, 4. I have to say X, Y, and Z, Thanksgiving, and then do this and ask for the Redskins or ask for that and finish. No. It's about opening up to God. Everything, let's read it again. Spoke with him about all that was in her heart. What are your feelings? What are your emotions? What are your desires? What are your ambitions? Where do you want to be in life? Are you sad? Are you upset? Just pour your heart in front of God. This is the only way to get a real communion with God. And clearly she was very successful in doing that. We don't know exactly how many hours she spent with him or how many days, but clearly everything that she was in her heart, she poured out in front of him. There might have been some embarrassing things, I don't know, that she mentioned to him. But through that, just by opening up to him, she got the comfort and the answer that she was looking for. It always reminds me with the Samaritan woman. We actually don't know how much time did she spend with Christ. I could imagine maybe 30 minutes, maybe 40 minutes, I don't know, maybe hour, I don't know. But clearly, she got a lot during this time. She was the only person at that time to talk about Christ as the Messiah. Peter didn't do it. The rest of the disciples didn't say it. Nicodemus, the great teacher of the Jewish nation, didn't say it. But she, in 30 minutes or half an hour, an hour or something, she was able to say it. Because she really had this deep touch with Christ, this encounter with Christ, this conversation. She opened up big time to him. And that's exactly what happened here with the Queen of Sheba. Notice something, that she didn't go there just to watch. And we do that a lot, unfortunately. We come to church just عشان نتفرج. We come to church to look at what Abuna is doing and what the deacons are doing and who is saying what and is the church crowded today or not. Who cares? We are coming here to have an encounter with Christ. She didn't go there just to look at the temple and the palace. Who cares about the temple or the palace? Or she only here to talk to Solomon, to have an encounter with Solomon. And this is why she was very successful at the end of her trip. It's not about just looking and socializing with people. It is about having an encounter with Christ. She did 3 things: effort, gift, and opened up. The response was equivalent to the steps that she took. She put lots of effort, she got lots of comfort. If she was tired from that long trip, or she reached the place exhausted, she got lots of comfort at the end. She provided him with a lot of gifts, and we thought that these are very expensive gifts. Let's see what she received in verse 13. Now King Solomon gave the Queen of Sheba all she desired. Everything that she wanted, she got. Whatever she asked, everything that she asked for, she got. In addition to that, besides what Solomon had given her according to the royal generosity. God will never ever be indebted to any of us. Never. It never happened, and it never will, that he will be indebted to any of us. As much as we give, and we give generously from our time, from our money, from our heart, emotions, lives, and so forth, God will give us even more. Don't be cheap with God. She opened up to him in verse 2. In verse 3, the answer right away was, so Solomon answered all her questions. She was very open with him. There's nothing that she hid from him. The response to that was, God answered all her questions. I wanted to say something about what she saw when she met with him. If we go to verse 4, and when the queen of Sheba had seen all the wisdom of Solomon, this is Christ, the house that he had built, this is the church, the food on his table, that's the Eucharist, the blood and body of Jesus Christ, the seating of his servants, these are the ministries of the church, the service of his waiters and the apparel, these are the priests and deacons of the church, his cupbearers, and the entryway by which he went up to the house of the Lord. So it portrays to us an image of the church of the New Testament with the sacraments and the services that are being offered. The most important part of this chapter we find in her speech to him. In verse 6 and 7, then she said to the king, after she saw all that, before that the Bible tells us that after she saw all that, there was no more spirit in her. She was stunned from the glory and the honor that she saw. And then in verse 6, then she said to the king, it was a true report which I heard in my own land about your words and your wisdom. However, I did not believe the words until I came and saw with my own eyes. I heard a lot, but I didn't believe until I saw with my own eyes. And indeed, the half was not told me. Everything that I heard about you was a half or a less than a half from what I saw. And this is actually the most important message today. If you recall at the beginning, I mentioned that this part here, this story, it elevates our relationship with Christ from the level of hearing to the level of experience. And here we saw the prize. She heard a lot about him before. She heard about his wisdom and the temple and the riches and the glory that he lives in. She heard about all that. But all that was nothing compared with what she saw. You know, we always do the opposite. This lady, she heard, but what she heard was half of what she experienced. We do the opposite. We hear a lot, but we experience the half or even much less than the half. And this is the danger and the sickness of the church today, that we hear a lot. We hear a lot. We have a lot of knowledge. There is no lack of sermons or talks or the internet now and TVs and everything. You can find lots of knowledge. There is no doubt in my mind about that. The problem is who is willing to experience, who is willing to have this encounter with Christ. And it makes a big difference, tremendous difference between hearing and experience. Remember the born blind? When after Christ healed him, the Jews came and asked him, is he a sinner? Is Christ a sinner? You know what was his answer? His answer was, is he a sinner? I don't know. But the only thing I know is that I was blind and now I can see. The only thing I know about him is the experience that I had with him. You say about him, he's a sinner, he's a prophet, you say whatever you want, it doesn't matter to me. That what matters to me is the encounter and the experience that I had with him. This is what spiritual life is all about. It's not about knowledge or hearing or listening. It is about what is it that I'm going to do to have this encounter with Christ. You know, there is one of the great saints of the church. His name is Saint Polycarpus. He was A bishop, I believe, for Azmir, if I'm not mistaken. And he was about to be delivered to die for Christ. He was about to be martyred. And before they took him to be martyred, some of the people in his congregation came to him and said, you have to deny Christ, otherwise they will kill you. Do you know what was his answer? Deny him? How can I deny him? For 87 years, I have never seen anything bad from him. How can I deny him? You know, he could have said, how can I deny him? I am a bishop. How can I deny him? I give sermons. How come I deny him? I read something about him in the Bible, or some story, or I don't know. He could have lots of reasons. But the only reason he is not going to deny Christ is 87 years. I experienced him, and I have saw nothing wrong with him. I haven't seen anything bad from him. How can I deny him? This is, my beloved, is the life of experience, that my encounter with Christ would change my life. I can't stress this anymore. It's not about knowledge, it's not about talking, it's not about hearing, but it is about this encounter, this personal relationship, this time in which I leave everything behind me and I get my quiet time with him. I talk to him and listen to his word. Running out of time, but I want to finish with a very important point too. If you notice that everything that she brought with her, all the gifts that she brought with her end up where? In his backyard? Where? All the gold and the woods and the precious stones, where it end up? In the temple, in the house of the Lord. In the house of the Lord. Everything, the gifts that she bought were used to build the house of the Lord, the temple. And this is actually the fruit of the encounter with Christ, that my life and my deeds and my behavior would contribute to building the house of the Lord. I'm not talking about the building and the stones and the concrete and steel and those things, but I'm talking about building the kingdom of God, serving others and helping others know Christ and get closer to Christ. It was a very fruitful encounter. The end of it was not only comfort for her, but also a service to the house of the Lord, building for the kingdom of heaven. I hope that you love this story as much as I love it. It seemed a dry story at the beginning, but there are lots to be done. I hope you can go back home and read it, and God will open your eyes to learn more and more. Any questions? Any questions? Okay, let's stand up for prayer.
Name of the Father, Son, and Spirit, amen. Our dear Heavenly Father, Lord God, thank you so much, Lord, for bringing us here today and for the words you spoke to Fahim. Dear Lord, we just pray, Lord, that just like the Queen of Sheba, Lord, came to you, Lord, and she sat at the feet of Solomon, Lord, and just listened, and didn't try to suggest anything, didn't try to put her own ideas out there, Lord, but just listened. We pray, Lord, that we could just come to you, Lord, and sit at your feet and just listen to you, Heavenly Father, and let you, Lord, just teach us, and let you, Lord, just show us, Lord, that what it is you want to show us, Lord, and leave with something so precious that she left with, Lord, that she just gave all the riches of the world, Lord, because it was nothing compared to what she received, Heavenly Father. And dear Lord, we just pray, Lord, that our lives could really contribute to your kingdom, Heavenly Father, like hers did, and we could just, come to you, Lord, humble ourselves and come to you and leave amazed.